Thank you very much. I'm very happy as well to be in this meeting tonight, and would like to thank the cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation and UK Feminist for hosting and arranging, what I feel is a very important discussion at this point, and particularly as Scotland thinks of the way forward in terms of addressing demand. At Equality Now, we really believe in the power of the law as a means to bring about change for women and girls. So in the context of sex trafficking and prostitution, which we also appreciate are forms of sexual exploitation, we really believe that governments need to be putting in place and implementing laws that are in line with international law. So really looking at, things like CEDAW, the Women's Convention, the Palermo Protocol, the 1949 Convention on for the suppression of the traffic in persons and of the exploitation of prostitution of others. So that entire sort of international framework giving, countries a basis to start from. As well as taking into account gender equality and human rights principles. I just wanted to start off by making the point, which I think others have said before as well, that sex trafficking and prostitution are really part of the continuum of violence against women, and that they are rooted in gender and systemic inequality and male entitlement. Broadly speaking, when we are thinking about the commercial sex trade or prostitution, I think most people default to thinking about the woman or the person who's selling sex. And it's not immediately that people think about the person who's buying, the pimps and the traffickers and the brothel keepers who are running the sex trade industry and making huge profits in the process. And I think even less considered are the systems and conditions that lead to people selling or being sold for sex and the conditions in which they do so. So this sort of person-centric view, which is focused on an individual, I think what it does is that it then reduces these systemic inequalities and conditions to be seen as obstacles that you can overcome at an individual level, rather than really looking at them as societal issues that require whole society interventions. So given this, I think it's extremely important that our analysis of the commercial sex trade takes a systemic approach. In our societies, as we know that, gender and sex-based inequality and discrimination mean that women and girls are more likely to have limited access to resources, limited access to education, are more likely to be in poverty, more likely to experience child sexual abuse, and bear the brunt of other forms of marginalization like systemic racism, for instance. And I think we've also seen presently in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, how the pandemic has exposed and worsened the situation, increased levels of poverty, and so on across our societies, and placing even more vulnerable people at the risk of being trafficked or coerced into prostitution. So with all this, we begin to see that sexual exploitation is really part of the continuum of gender-based violence. We see this point as well clearly articulated in the Equally Safe strategy, where gender-based violence is defined as a function of gender inequality, and that this violence also includes violence perpetrated by men in relation to acts of commercial sexual exploitation, of which prostitution is one aspect. And also at the international level, what we've seen in just the last month in November, the CEDAW committee in its new general recommendation on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration, have also specifically reinforced the understanding that trafficking and exploitation of prostitution of women and girls is unequivocally a phenomenon that is rooted in structural gender-based discrimination, and that it constitutes gender-based violence, and that it's also exacerbated in the context of social and economic injustices, displacement, discrimination in migration and asylum regimes, for instance. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, those exploited in the sex trade experience physical violence and emotional trauma. So prostitution itself is inherently violent. There's no way, I think someone has said before, that we can look at it as anything that can be safe because it is violence in itself. So taking all of that into account, it then sort of follows then that the legal and policy solutions we should be aiming for are exactly as other speakers have said before, which is the Nordic model, and really looking at removing any criminal sanctions on those exploited. They should not be criminalized, as this amounts to, in fact, criminalizing people who are victims of the system and whose rights are being violated. The very existence of trafficking and prostitution makes women's right to equality unattainable. So, really looking at taking away the criminality on the part of those that are exploited, and ensuring that they are supported as well as supported to exit. And that, as we think about the laws we come up with, and policy solutions, that within that we are also addressing the gender and systemic inequalities that breed vulnerability to exploitation. The second point really is that we cannot ignore the fact that sex trafficking and prostitution are driven by demand. So if we follow the money, it's coming from the pockets of those who are buying sex. From there, it then creates this chain of exploiters that are benefiting and profiting from the sex trade, your pimps, your brothel keepers, and traffickers. So without the demand of those that are buying, the sex trade would not exist and thrive. So in order to end the sexual exploitation, it really becomes imperative to address the demand. And addressing demand in law means criminalizing those who buy sex, and it amounts to shifting responsibility and accountability to those who are using their power, their money, their position of privilege to buy vulnerable people. And it's also about sending a strong message in society that it is unacceptable to buy sex. And we also need to then, look at it in terms of wholesome legislation that then targets the range of actors involved in the exploitation chain, from procuring, pimping, and also strengthening existing trafficking legislation. Putting in place legislative measures to address demand is something that's already provided for in international law that the UK has ratified. So the UN Palermo Protocol on Trafficking mandates governments to take steps to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and girls, that leads to trafficking. And the CEDAW committee has also called on governments to address demand, particularly that they must investigate, prosecute, and convict all perpetrators involved in the trafficking of persons, including those on the demand side. And I think, as we have had examples from France and Sweden and Ireland, in terms of how that legislative model is working. In conclusion, I would say that in the long term, because what we are really aiming for is societal change, for society to look at prostitution as unacceptable. So to be effective, the legislative approach must be accompanied by widespread public information, and education, training for police and others in the judicial system. And I think that has been the experience from other countries as well, that it really needs to be accompanied by in-depth training for the police, the judiciary, the prosecution, and frontline workers in education, social services. So really looking at the whole ambit of society, the NHS and local government, and that we also need to ensure that the law is properly coordinated and implemented consistently at the national level, to ensure that, what we then have is the law, but accompanied by some of these other measures to be able to have that sort of societal change that we are aiming for. Yeah, so I'd end here. Thank you very much.